It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. On Wednesday, the European Parliament's lawmakers backed the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Europe and Canada, known as CETA, by a vote of 408 to 254. Supporters of the agreement argue that it will boost growth for both Europe and Canada. Before the vote, European Commissioner for Trade Cecilia Malmström defended the agreement to EU lawmakers, saying that it was done in a transparent manner, and critique of the process was unfair. Let's have a look.
So I respect that there will be people voting in favour and against, but calling a trade agreement with Canada a coup d'etat is frankly going too far.
However, CETA has been the focus of demonstrations in Europe, led by trade unions, environmental and civil society, as well as human rights groups, which say it will lead to a race to the bottom in labor and environmental standards, allowing multinational corporations to dictate public policy. The European Parliament vote is not a done deal. The implementation of CETA will have to clear more than 36 national and regional parliaments. Joining us today to discuss the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement and its future is Jean Blaylock. She is a policy officer at Global Justice Now and has worked over a decade on international trade and food issues. Thanks for joining us today, Jean.
Thank you for asking me.
So, Jean, let's get to that comment by the Trade Commissioner. What did she mean when she said that, calling this a coup d'etat is going too far?
I think she's putting up a straw man. I mean, there are very serious concerns about the secrecy and transparency, a lack of transparency with which CETA was negotiated. It was negotiated behind closed doors for years without any public debate over the text or being able to see what was being discussed and agreed to. And the result is something that will lead to increased corporate power and reduced ability of democratic governments to shape their own regulations. The concerns about this are very real. And her outrage is unjustified.
What are some of the main concerns around it?
Well, it's not really a deal about trade. There is already very open trade between Europe and Canada. It's a deal that's mainly about deregulation, increased privatization, and the parts of the agreement that could lead to corporations being able to sue governments when corporations are unhappy with regulations that governments make. So these kinds of concerns are likely to undermine workers' rights. And whilst the proponents of CETA will argue that there will be economic benefits, actually studies show that there will be very few benefits and there could actually be job losses as a result of CETA.
Okay. Given that there was a Brexit vote and the UK is in the process of leaving the European, at least the Euro, what does this mean for the UK? And also, given that this kind of deal has to be debated and discussed in each parliament and then passed, is UK going through that process?
Well, CETA still applies to the UK until we actually leave the EU, which will not be for another 2 years. It will still be provisionally implemented within the UK. And if CETA is fully ratified before the UK leaves the EU, then there is what's called a sunset clause in it, which will mean that some of the provisions around corporate courts will actually continue to apply to the UK for 20 years afterwards. So it's still very much a matter for the UK and for citizens here. And there is a lot of public concern. A lot of people have been taking action. They've been writing to their MEPs and expressing their concerns, and they'll still be trying to raise those concerns. There's not so much scope, though, unfortunately, within the UK for them to be heard. Although the Brexit vote was taken with a lot of rhetoric about taking back control and parliamentary sovereignty, actually There's very little parliamentary scrutiny of trade deals at the moment. This trade deal can be brought to Parliament, and if nobody objects to it within 21 days, then it will be taken to be agreed. And that's a very weak process. It's abysmal, really, that's all that's needed. And it's part of the reason why we're getting these very bad trade deals, because there is not the kind of democratic debate that there ought to be around our trade policy.
Right. And what is the next stage in order for CETA to pass, and how many different parliaments must debate the agreement? Or will there be any debate at all, as you're suggesting, in the UK?
Well, CETA, large parts of CETA will actually start to be implemented from the start of March, because now that it's been agreed by the European Parliament, they can go ahead with what's called provisional implementation. So some of it will just start coming into force from March onwards, regardless of the debates in Parliament. While the process in the UK is limited, as I've said, there are other countries that have much more thorough processes within the EU, where there will actually be real debate and real votes, and people will actually have a real chance to have their voices heard. So to some extent, we in the UK are going to have to be supporting our colleagues in other countries within the EU to try and raise some of these concerns.
Right, and I understand that last week a report co-published by the Corporate European Observatory, or CEO, it claims that CETA will further empower corporate lobbyists by providing them with early exclusive access to the legislative process. What can you tell us about some of the findings of this report that we should be concerned about?
Well, it's about something that's called regulatory cooperation, which sounds incredibly dry. It means that there are provisions within the trade deal that say that the EU must tell Canada and its business partners about any legislation that they are planning to introduce. And so this means that ideas for legislation could be being discussed within the regulatory cooperation structures before they become public. And this will give a chance for corporations to bring their objections about possible laws and regulations and stop them before they've even got started, really, before there's any public debate, before there is any resistance to the corporate interests. So it's a high chance that there will be laws that just never make it past that stage because they get blocked by the business lobbying. And
if we are to continue to resist CETA, what are some of the things that people could be engaged in order to make sure that proper debate actually happens and there's greater transparency in this process?
Well, for CETA itself, I mean, it's about getting in touch with Parliament, members of Parliament, and letting them know about concerns. But I think it is also part of the wider picture. It does illustrate to us that we do need to change the way that we approach trade policy. There needs to be much more openness about trade policy to prevent us getting into this kind of situation. We need to move to a situation where there's actually public debate about what should be going into trade policy and what deals should be being started and what sorts of things we should be looking for in trade policy before we start, rather than us always ending up in these situations where we're faced with a very bad and toxic deal that we are resisting. We really need to get to a situation where people are able to have a say in the way that they ought to be in democratic processes about what the policy should be to start with.
Jean, in the past, your organization has been very successful in defeating these types of trade agreements. What are your plans to defeat this one?
We will be moving to look at the parliamentary process to try and get some debates happening, because I think at the minute many of the members of parliament in the UK just don't really know what this deal is. They don't know about it because it's been happening in Europe and they're not aware of the concerns that have been raised. So we'll be trying to bring those concerns straight to the parliament here in the UK.
All right, Gina, thank you so much for joining us today, and look forward to the successes you might have as a result of the fight back. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.